Hey everybody, thanks for joining us today for our election preview. Appreciate everybody taking time out of their day to listen to us talk about what we think is going to happen in this election. This will mostly be an overview of what is likely to happen in the Senate races and the House races. As you'll hear me say, it's the president's race, just despite what you've been hearing in the news and seeing in the polls, is probably a little bit too close to call. But we will go through a heck of a lot of stuff today. We'll talk about our legislative champions in the House and Senate and the outlook for them. Throw in a little fun stuff here and there. And again, appreciate folks taking time out of their day. I'll start by saying two things. One, when anyone asks me to make a prediction on any election, I say, tell me what the headlines are the day before the election, and I will tell you who wins. That is my way of saying that we're a little less than 2 weeks out, and that is still, despite what the newspapers will have you believe, a very long time. Reporters that were saying back in August that, we're in the home stretch of this election is just ridiculous. Things can turn around very, very quickly, as we have seen in the 2016 election. This time, 4 years ago, I was giving presentation after presentation on how this was all but locked up for Hillary Clinton. And this slide that you see on your screen, this is the New York Times from October 18th. This was a done deal. This election was over. And then it was not. And we're seeing some of those same trends come back. So understandably, the Biden camp is a little nervous, as he should be, unlike Hillary Clinton's campaign, who was decidedly not nervous and treated the election as if they had already won. She wasn't leading in every conceivable poll, but states that were not supposed to be battleground states were not only much closer than anyone had thought. Some of them, as we'll see, and as you remember, of course, went for Trump. And it is a little bit eerie how much 2020 is subtly looking like that. It's not as overt yet. To the point where a lot of Biden's team, like I said, are genuinely scared about a repeat. But there are some very, very key differences here, which we will discuss, which make this a decidedly different election than 2016. This is a chart from just before the 2016 election, and I'm talking the day before the 2016 election from the New York Times. I am sure I don't have to tell you all that national polling is meaningless when it comes to presidential elections. It doesn't matter how much a certain candidate is up nationwide. It matters only in key states. Hillary Clinton was always up nationally, and she won nationally. She got 3 million more votes than Trump, but she is not the president. And it is very much worth noting how fast Trump's numbers were rising over that period, the final 2 weeks of the campaign, which of course is what we're in now. I want to compare what you're seeing here to what's going on in 2020 in some of these states and see if Trump's numbers in these key states are likely to make a spike like this again. As you can see, he went up dramatically over the last 2 weeks in some of these key states, and that's how he won some of them. We'll start in Arizona, a pretty decent microcosm of what's been happening across the country. I apologize that this might be a little bit hard to read on your screen, but suffice to say, Arizona has always been a reliably red state. A little over 2 years ago, Arizona was represented in the U.S. Senate by 2 Republicans. It had a Republican governor. It had Republican majorities in both chambers of their state legislature. That is all changing. By the time this election is over, it's possible that the only statewide candidate to be a Republican will be the governor, and even he is pretty unpopular. So that it might not totally change in 2020, but it is certainly trending that way. In 2016, Trump won Arizona by 4 points, but he has been down in most polling since down or even in a lot of polling since March. Certainly his treatment of John McCain didn't help him there, and McCain's widow recently, of course, endorsed Joe Biden, and that didn't help in Arizona. But he's also saddled with a very unpopular senator in Martha McSally, and we will talk more about her in a bit. Let's look at North Carolina. Another state that Trump won, and that has seriously tightened up to the point where it is about neck and neck in terms of the presidential race. Biden can afford to lose this one, but Trump really can't. So we'll be talking about a very fascinating Senate race in a minute. But North Carolina is one of several states where the Trump campaign is seeking to block the counting of absentee ballots, which arrive after Election Day. And he's done that in a few states. He lost that battle on Pennsylvania on Monday, and he lost that battle in North Carolina yesterday. A U.S. Federal Appeals Court ruled that they left in place, basically, the state's plan for counting absentee ballots that arrive after Election Day. In other words, Trump was challenging in a few of these states that if that ballots had to arrive on election day, they couldn't count. In Pennsylvania, North Carolina, judges threw those out and said they can receive ballots for up to 3 days after election day. They're trying this, of course, because as you probably know, many more Republican voters are expected to vote in person. A lot of the absentee and mail-in voting that you're seeing going on now in record numbers are primarily Democrats. That said, again, the race will still be very tight in North Carolina, and we'll talk more about a fascinating Senate race there in a minute. Looking at Pennsylvania, of course, always a battleground state. Trump won this in 2016, but as Joe Biden will never, ever let you forget, it is his home state, to the point where a lot of folks in recent polls thought that he actually served in the Senate as a senator from Pennsylvania. And of course, he was not. He was elected by the people of Delaware. But there are some people in Pennsylvania that think at some point he was their senator. Trump held a rally in Erie, of course, just yesterday. Biden has been doing virtual events there. Kamala was there not so long ago. Early voting will be, as I mentioned, a huge factor there. And again, the state Supreme Court let stand a ruling that the mailed-in ballots can be received up to 3 days after the election day. But in general, Biden is leading Pennsylvania, a very key battleground state. This hasn't really wavered all that much. He is favored to win, and he's likely to win Pennsylvania, which very much limits Trump's path to 270 electoral college delegates. Iowa is another one where the unpopularity of the senator is having a very tangible effect on Trump, and vice versa, really. It's impossible to tell how much, and I would imagine it's not very much, but with Trump needing all the help he can get, the Senate race is not ideal, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. I would actually be very surprised if Trump loses Iowa. But remember, this was a state he won by 10 points in 2016. It wasn't really all that close. It was a state that wasn't really expected to be in play for Biden. But as you can see, the polling has him up by just about the margin, or at least around the margin of error, if not leading outright. Again, I'm not sure that's one he'll actually win, but the fact that Trump is having to spend resources in Iowa to defend it is pretty surprising. Michigan is, of course, the state that many people say cost Hillary Clinton the election. To be fair, even if she had won Michigan and that state's 16 electoral votes, she would still have lost the election. But prior to her defeat in 2016, a Democratic presidential candidate hadn't lost Michigan in 30 years. So whatever your opinion about Clinton and as a candidate, her campaign made some grave tactical errors, as I'm sure they would tell you, ignored Michigan as she did. Many folks heard the story that there was a caravan of union and pro-union folks that were headed to Michigan from Iowa to help get out the vote and help kind of gin up support. As they were on their way to Michigan from Iowa, they were called back to Iowa, saying that they weren't needed, that Michigan was in the bag, there was no reason to worry about it. It made more sense to keep them in Iowa, and not because they thought they were going to win Iowa. Remember what a one-sided victory that was for Trump. But just to make Trump think that they knew something that he didn't. They were basically trying to trick the Trump campaign into spending more money in Iowa. And the unions in Michigan don't forget things like that. When you've got union folks that are on their way to help win your state and you turn them back, they have memories. To be sure, Biden is not making those same mistakes. It's also worth noting at this point that there aren't really any viable third-party candidates to siphon off votes from either candidate. I say that because in 2016, Hillary Clinton lost the state by only about 11,000 votes. And in that election, Gary Johnson, remember Gary Johnson? Gary Johnson got about 172,000 votes, and Jill Stein, who was, of course, the Green Party candidate, got about 51,000 votes. There will not be nearly that many votes going to third parties this year, which definitely favors Biden. No disrespect to the Kanye fans out there. Kanye's not getting 172,000 votes across the country, much less in Michigan. He's actually not even on the ballot in Michigan, I should say. And while we're on the subject, for those who care, Kanye is only on the ballot in 11 states, 8 of those 11 are rock solid red states anyway. The only 2 states where he might be any sort of a factor are Minnesota and Colorado, but I definitely would not count on that. Anyway, enough about Kanye. So a state that wasn't even on the list, earlier list that you saw, that chart of places where Trump was making big pushes in 2016, it wasn't on that list because it was supposed to be a slam dunk for Hillary Clinton in Wisconsin. A state Obama won by 7 points in 2012, but Hillary lost again by a very small margin, about 25,000 votes. Famously, she didn't campaign there. She presumed a win that was snatched from her by Trump, who, to his credit, went in and made a lot of promises to end unfair trade practices that had hurt the state's dairy industry. He was going to bring back manufacturing jobs. And one could argue that up until the pandemic started, he could have campaigned on a very similar platform. But the virus has absolutely ravaged Wisconsin. One day last week, they reported more than 3,700 cases in one day. And when you add to that decreasing opinions in Wisconsin of Trump's policies, it's hard to see how Trump holds on to that less than 1% victory he had in 2016. Maybe these numbers change quickly in the next 2 weeks. Maybe tomorrow night's debate truly turns things around for Trump. But the fact is his campaign has pulled all advertising out of Wisconsin, as they have in Michigan, by the way, which would imply that they've given up hope on it. But looking at where we are, it leads you to ask, well, what happened? What happened to Trump's momentum? What happened to the campaign? Why is it that Biden is leading in all these polls today? It's not as simple as saying COVID, though that is obviously a very, very huge part of it. If you ask the media, they're going to give you 50 different reasons and 50 different articles. He's lost women, he's lost college-educated white men, he's lost seniors, he's lost evangelicals, he's lost Mormons, it's the never Trumpers. A lot of people make a lot of money per word writing this sort of thing. And of course, the answer is not as simple as any of these. It is, in fact, a combination of all of these things. He has just lost enough of every target demographic to be in serious electoral trouble. But frankly, and I don't want to come off here as partisan at all. I deliberately make these presentations as nonpartisan as humanly possible, and I'm looking to do that here. But the fact is, and this is not me saying this, this is the American people saying this, the American people, by and large, even those who don't follow politics, and even those who support Trump, are increasingly fatigued by this president. Hillary Clinton had the 1-2 punch of having a massively negative favorability rating and a brash, out of the box, tell it like it is, fresh opponent, and that turned out to be enough to lead to her defeat. Now that same brashness for Donald Trump is turning into a liability, and there is nowhere near that level of dislike for Joe Biden. In fact, most people aren't thinking that much at all about Joe Biden, which is exactly why he's running the kind of campaign he is. Let Trump fill up the airwaves by saying negative things about masks and scientists and Dr. Fauci. Dr. Fauci, who, by the way, holds a 56% approval rating, even among Republicans. And just saying, generally saying that we should just ignore the virus. At this point, that's a better ad for Biden than anything he could put out himself. Biden's maybe the most understated campaign since the invention of campaigns, and yet his favorability rating keeps ticking up. So he is sure not going to change what's working in these last 2 weeks. In fact, it's a play that worked for Trump in 2016. It's easy to forget now, when you think of Trump's tweeting, but in the home stretch 4 years ago, right around those last 2 weeks, he surprised a lot of folks. He largely stayed off Twitter, he stayed on message, and he drove home his argument that crooked Hillary was everything wrong with the Washington establishment. And it worked, and it resonated. And he obviously can't do any negative knocks against the Washington establishment, because at this point, that's him. But it worked at the time. It kept the spotlight on Clinton. It helped drive late deciding voters his way. So to sum up the presidential side of things, Trump threaded that needle really well on his path to victory 4 years ago by winning Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania by fewer than 80,000 votes combined. That's how thin those margins were in those 3 states. He is unlikely to win any of those 3 this year at the rate we're going. He could repeat a path. He has paths to 270 electoral college votes. And again, we are seeing overall polling tick up ever so slightly for the president as we come down these final 2 weeks. But he has very, very little room for error and very, very little time. That said, just for the heck of it, if you're a betting man, these are the Vegas odds, and they're swinging back to Trump. So if you're looking for a solid answer as to who is going to win, I can say with absolute certainty it is going to be Donald Trump or Joe Biden, and that's the best I can do. I will. That's the best any of us can do. You've seen the polling, you know what it is. But as of now, if I had to guess, of course, it would be Biden. But we've still got 1 week and 6 days till election day. I will pause there before we start talking about the Senate races and see if anybody has any questions. Anything in the queue, Joy?
Nope, not seeing anything right now, Justin.
All right. If anybody has any questions at any time, please do. I should have said this at the outset. You've got a question box there on the right of your screen in that little toolbox. Please do ask questions, even if it's not a race I'm talking about. If it's about a House race, something, please do throw questions out there. I am happy to. This is my favorite thing in the world, is to debate about this stuff. We wonky DC folks could talk about this stuff literally all day, every day, and never get sick of it. So please do throw out questions if you've got any. Who will control the Senate in the 117th is at this point, it's a big of question mark as who will be the president. There are still a lot of moving parts, but let's look at some key races. And I will actually, unlike the presidential race, I will give a prediction on this one, even though you might think it's a bit of a cop-out. And I'll give you a very bold prediction on the House while we're talking about it. The Democrats will absolutely keep the House. There's zero chance that the Republicans will control the House. In fact, it's highly likely that Democrats will pick up a few more seats, as the Republicans have 27 representatives who are not seeking re-election, and the Democrats only have 10. That opens up a lot of open seats on the Republican side in districts that can be switched. And this is, of course, as we've seen, not the best time to be running as a Trump-supporting Republican in general. So there's no question in my mind, despite what you might read in the press, that the Democrats keep the House. In fact, they will build on that lead. We'll talk about that a little bit more later, but let's look at the Senate. I have listed the 10 races here that I think will decide the makeup of the Senate, and we'll talk about the top 7 of them. First off, and I think folks have probably been reading this, the Democrats will almost certainly lose the seat that they won a few years ago in Alabama with the defeat of Senator Doug Jones. As you remember, Jones won that seat over Roy Moore, a guy who didn't seem to think that coming on to underage girls was a big deal, and really lost every Republican in the state, and led Doug Jones to a win. It was really a slam dunk for Jones at the time. This year, he is, of course, running against former Auburn football coach Tommy Tuberville, whose main qualification to be a U.S. Senator seems to be that he is former Auburn coach Tommy Tuberville. His campaign style has been very much like Biden's. You just sit back, you don't say much, don't be the other guy, and it is working. So almost certain that seat will flip, which is one of the very, very small pieces of good news for the Republicans. And there's some of the polling you've seen. Tuberville is up every recent poll, and no reason to think that Doug Jones will be able to pull that one off. If he does, by some miracle, you can bet that the blue wave will certainly be in full effect on Election Day, but I don't think that's one that the Democrats will be able to hold on to. That win for the Republicans in Alabama will already be offset by a loss in Colorado, where a very popular former governor named John Hickenlooper is expected to beat Cory Gardner, who's the incumbent. You may recall John Hickenlooper as the guy who had a very, very brief and very, very forgettable presidential run. And as he was running for president said, and I'm quoting here, I wouldn't be very good at it, being a senator. And he said he's not cut out to be a U.S. senator. Despite that, he is running, and he has never trailed in the polls by less than 5 points. This is definitely one that you can chalk up to at least partially a dislike of Trump in Colorado, and frankly, a bit of waffling by Gardner, who was staunchly opposed to Trump during the 2016 presidential election, but then, like so many others, got on board quickly when Trump won, but now, again, is slightly backing off of his support of Trump. He's not alone in that at all, and we'll talk more about that phenomenon in a second. But this one is almost certainly going to go the Democrats' way. So 1 loss, 1 win for the Democrats, if you're keeping tabs. Yeah, and here you see headlines. It's just anti-Trump sentiment is sweeping Colorado like a few other states, and that combined with Gardner not running a very good campaign is going to cost him that seat. Back to Arizona. In Arizona, the race is between Senator Martha McSally, who was never elected. She was appointed to that seat following the death of Senator John McCain. She, of course, ran a losing senatorial campaign against Kristen Sinema in 2018 and lost that one as well. So she was appointed to the seat. She's running against Mark Kelly, who is an astronaut, a very well-known astronaut, and the husband of former Arizona Representative Gabby Giffords, who you might remember was shot by a deranged constituent at a campaign event, and has since become a staunch gun control advocate and a very well-respected leader of the gun control movement. But frankly, Gabby and Mark are wildly popular in Arizona and always have been, even before Mark was running for Senate. McSally, not so much. It's an understatement. This could be one of the few states that Trump wins, but doesn't at all help the down ballot races. Again, McSally was never particularly popular. She has hurt herself even more in recent debate performances. More on that in a minute. And Kelly has never, ever been down in the polls from the start of his getting into this race. It would take a miracle for the Republicans to keep this seat. So these first three, I'm going to say, are guaranteed. The Democrats will lose Alabama, but they will pick up Colorado and they will pick up Arizona. Now getting into one of the most fun and interesting Senate races this year, the North Carolina race. This has been my favorite one to follow because there has been so much fascinating political intrigue. The race is between Thom Tillis, a very, very pro-Trump first-term senator who beat a Democrat in 2014 to take the seat, and a guy named Cal Cunningham, who's a former state senator. He ran unsuccessfully for the North Carolina Senate seat back in 2010. He lost and had been pretty much out of politics for the most part. This race was trending, as most swing states races are, with Cunningham enjoying small to fairly moderate leads. And then a few weeks back, the whole race was thrown into disarray when, after towing the party line about the relative harmlessness of COVID, Senator Tillis himself contracted COVID and had to quarantine for 2 weeks during what should have been the most important stretches of the campaign. Most folks thought that's the nail in the coffin. There's no way he comes back from this. But literally within a few days of that news, the story broke that Cunningham, the Democratic challenger, was exchanging, shall we say, racy text messages with a political consultant in California. He has since been asked in subsequent interviews, are there other dalliances, any other outside things that we should know about? And he's been very reluctant to answer those questions. And in DC and in the media generally, if you don't answer a question, the answer might as well be yes, but he just hasn't answered those questions. So what could have been a slam dunk has been made a lot more difficult for Cunningham, a lot more interesting for those of us who are following this race, but a heck of a lot more difficult for Cunningham. That said, recent polling suggested that about a quarter of likely voters have said that sexting scandal will make a difference. There's a lot of apathy for it. There was a poll that said his unfavorable rating has gone from 29% to 41% unfavorable. That said, if the 2016 election taught us anything, it's that you can still very much dislike someone and hold your nose and vote for him, which seems to be what is happening in that race. The race, frankly, could simply come down to which party gets more people to the polls, though it does increasingly look like Cunningham will pull this off, which would put the race, real race for control of the Senate in Iowa. If Cunningham is able to run away with this thing, as it's looking, runaway is probably too strong a word. Pull it off is probably a better choice of words. It's close, but it looking like he's going to win, which would make the real race for control of the Senate in Iowa, which we will talk about. It's another fascinating race, but we'll talk about that in a minute. After we talk about the one that I am sure everyone is following, even if you don't want to, because it's all over the news, and that's the race in Maine. You have heard about this race no matter where you live, because there's just been so much media focus on it. Susan Collins, of course, the incumbent senator, even Stephen King has weighed in on this race repeatedly. Senator Collins is running against a Democrat named Sarah Gideon, and this is not reported in the media very much, but there are actually 7 people in this race. It's Collins and Gideon, and then there's 5 more kind of fringe candidates, which is the way Maine Senate elections work. But this is really a 2-person race. Collins was first elected to the Senate in 1996. Gideon is currently the Speaker of the Maine House of Representatives. And of course, sorry, let me go back here if I can figure out how to do that. Collins, of course, has become increasingly unpopular in the state and across the country. She was criticized for her decision to vote to confirm Brett Kavanaugh. She faced criticism for her stance on the impeachment of Donald Trump. If you recall, she voted in favor of allowing witness testimony at the Senate trial, but then voted to acquit Trump on charges of abuse of power and a charge of obstruction of justice. Afterwards, she claimed that Trump probably, and here I'm quoting, learned a pretty big lesson from the impeachment, and then a couple of weeks later walked it back and said he probably hasn't learned anything from it. And so now, as the Senate prepares to confirm Amy Coney Barrett as the next Supreme Court justice, she has said there shouldn't be a vote before the election. She has actually listened to polls in her state and said there shouldn't be any sort of a vote for the Supreme Court justice before the election. However, the folks in Maine and across the country are viewing that as a purely political stance to help her election. They really don't need her to be involved in the process, assuming that Mike Pence can act as the tiebreaker. In fact, most of the moves that I have mentioned, the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh, voting for witness testimony, most of those are seen as political moves on her part in her home state. she is increasingly seen as someone who just doesn't have much of a backbone, and that may cost her the seat. Gideon was down in the polls when it first started, but as you can see, right around mid-September, things started ticking away for Sarah Gideon, and she has been slowly rising ever since. So still be interesting. If I had to pick a winner in this one, honestly, despite what it says on your screen, I would probably still give it to Collins, but we'll see what happens over the next 2 weeks. But let's talk about Iowa. And again, anybody has any questions, please do, or you want to argue with me about something, by all means, go into the question bar and ask some questions. Quick couple of points on the Iowa race, which is another fascinating one. 6 years after she won her office, she was probably the highest profile member of her election class. And that gave Republicans control of the Senate. Joni Ernst, a Republican from Iowa, she finds herself in a very tough re-election race against a businesswoman, Teresa Greenfield. And the money being spent on this race is insane. Greenfield has collected more than 100 million from donors, most of them outside of the state, and she has spent just about all of it coming at Joni Ernst. But all that money in this race, hundreds of millions of dollars. What's interesting about this race is that Ernst might find herself undone and losing that seat over a matter of about $4.50. That is because last week at a televised debate, the moderator of the debate asked Teresa Greenfield, the challenger, what's the break-even price of a bushel of corn? If you're an Iowa farmer, what's the break-even price? What do you have to sell a bushel of corn at on the open market just to break even? And Greenfield got the question exactly right, to the penny. And then they asked Joni Ernst what the break-even price for soybeans was. And she was way off. She was off by about $4.50. Now, most people might wonder who in the world would have such minutia of farming prices at their disposal. But in Iowa, if you're not up on the break-even price of commodities, it means you're out of touch, especially in light of the fact that Ernst actually owns a farm. You combine that with a pretty hefty spike in COVID cases in the state after Ernst was dismissive overall of the pandemic, and it is really costing her. I would note at this point, a little bit of an aside, how many interesting things have happened at the senatorial debates this year. Iowa, as I've mentioned, South Carolina, where Lindsey Graham referred to segregation as the quote-unquote good old days. Arizona, which we can talk about in a minute. That Senate, you've talked about the Senate race, but one of the things that McSally said at one of the debates, many of these senatorial debates have brought out some fascinating tidbits, and I would add very few went well for the incumbents. So you can see why incumbents on both sides are increasingly leery to even hold debates. So this all helped Teresa Greenfield pull away. It might not last for the next 2 weeks. This might get retightened up, but it's certainly proven how much the state is in play. And the polls are indicating it's costing Trump as well. So perhaps more than North Carolina, which again, I think will probably end up in the Democrats' hands. I think Iowa's the one to really watch for who is going to have control of that Senate. That will be the big one in my mind to watch next Tuesday. One last race I want to cover in depth, and that is in Montana, where Republican Steve Daines, the incumbent, is taking on a very, very popular governor. I want to highlight this race as Daines is a big champion of the O&P community. He is one of the original co-sponsors of the Senate version of the Medicare Orthotics and Prosthetics Patient-Centered Care Act. He's running against, like I said, Governor Steve Bullock, who is about as popular a Democrat as Montana has ever had. But that might not be enough. Daines has been pretty consistently a couple of percentage points ahead, either tied or ahead within the margin of error for sure. Trump has strongly supported Daines. Senator Mitch McConnell has made sure money keeps pumping in to the state and to Daines' campaign. Obviously, from an O&P perspective, we are hopeful that he holds this seat, since, as I mentioned, he is a staunch supporter of all of our work. But this could be a very close race. I think ultimately will go to Daines, but another one to keep our eyes on, because it is an interesting swing for the Senate race. Trump will win the state easily for the presidential race. But again, we want to keep our champions where they are. Real quick, before I sum this all up, some of you might be wondering, I did mention the Lindsey Graham race. Why is that not on this list? The fact is, South Carolina is getting a lot of national attention, but I would be very, very surprised if Lindsey Graham loses that seat. He is up in most polling, as is Trump. Trump won South Carolina by 15% in 2016. Graham's opponent, Jamie Harrison, is running an absolutely fantastic campaign, raised unbelievable amounts of money. He's doing a very good job of putting the spotlight on Graham rather than just bashing Graham's allegiance to Trump. Jamie Harrison knows how popular Trump is in the state. He knows that's not a winning idea to go after Trump. So he has been really hammering Graham, and Graham has not been doing himself any favors in some of the things he said, the verbal gaffes he's made, some of the things he said during the the Judiciary Committee confirmation hearings. But to me, this race, there's a lot that looks like that Beto O'Rourke, Ted Cruz race from a few years back. There's a lot of hype simply to maintain the status quo. I just don't think that seat is going to change hands. So if he manages to win, if Harrison manages to win, again, that'll certainly be an indicator of a blue wave on November 3rd. Real quick, we have 3 of our other Senate champions who are up for re-election this year. I don't have them on this list because 2 of their races are a little bit close, but not terribly close. And Bill Cassidy in Louisiana, that's a runaway. Mark Warner in Virginia is probably our biggest Senate champion. He always goes to bat for us. Also one of the original, actually all 3 of the guys you see on your screen are original sponsors of the Patient-Centered Care Act in the Senate. Warner's got a fairly, moderately tough race, but Virginia has been blue on the statewide level for some time and looks to stay that way. Cornyn's got a great challenger, just much like Jamie Harrison in South Carolina. MJ Heger in Texas is running a very, very good campaign and saying the right things, but it might be a little bit tough for her to get out ahead in Texas, which is, always been a Republican stronghold. And again, Cassidy running away is up, I think, 25 percentage points in Louisiana. So that one is a no-brainer. I've also listed, we work with a lot of really, really great senators on our efforts. So I wanted to list some of the other names who aren't up this year, but will be up for election in 2022. And I'll talk more about 2022 in just one second. One more interesting tidbit before I give you a flat out prediction. I know I'm putting that off because goodness knows things change by the minute. If somebody sends me a tweet, then I want to know about it before I give my prediction. But the number of Republicans in very tough re-election battles who have suddenly started to claim that they are not as beholden to Trump as their records would indicate is rising. I just mentioned John Cornyn. He has said, that I talk a lot about the president's policies and things I disagree with behind the scenes, but I just don't do it in public. A lot of people take that even in Texas with a grain of salt. I've been on enough Zoom meetings with Senator Cornyn to know that that is true. He does not always agree with the president. He just doesn't really do it all that much in front of cameras. So he's not wrong, but it's interesting he's going public with that statement. Senator Sass, of course, you probably read about this, had a bit of a diatribe on a conference call with constituents. Martha McSally, who we talked about in that Arizona race, who was wildly unpopular, was asked point blank, do you support Trump? And she refused to answer the question. She just said, I want to do what's best for the people of Arizona. And the people of Arizona know that she very, very much supports all of Trump's efforts. She has been a very big Trump cheerleader. And so it was a little awkward for her to try to distance herself at the last minute. But I think the most telling one, getting back to North Carolina, this quote you see on the bottom of the screen, this is something that several Republicans in tough states are starting to say, and it might give you a window into the election. They're basically not saying they agree or disagree with Trump. What they're saying is you need to reelect me so that I can be a check on a Biden presidency. Essentially, they're saying that the election is over and that Biden wins, and they need to keep a Republican majority in the Senate as a check on Biden. That is very different from what we were hearing even a month ago, where they were all saying, I'm here to support the president. I'm going to keep doing the president's work. Now, as things aren't looking so good, now the argument is, well, now I need to be a check on Biden. So they have, these senators have the best internal polling in the world. It makes you wonder what they're seeing, that they're starting to change their tune a little bit like that. All that said, this is a bit of a cop-out, I realize, maybe. I believe the Senate will end up 50-50, looking at the way the map is trending now. Maine, North Carolina, and Iowa will probably flip. And I maybe Maine will, maybe it won't, but for the sake of argument, I'm going to say that it will. North Carolina definitely will. I think that this is the kind of the way it goes down. It'll give the Democrats a net gain of 3 seats, puts the Senate into a 50-50 tie, which will be very interesting for the presidential election, because of course, whoever wins the presidential election will have the tie-breaking vote in the Senate. So it'll make for a very, very interesting next 4 years. The other thing to think about in that, if there is an even split, Mark Kelly, who again is going to win that Senate race in Arizona. Think about a guy like Joe Manchin in West Virginia, who's an incumbent Democrat. He's not up for re-election. He's going to stay there. But he is also, both of those guys, Mark Kelly and Joe Manchin, are very moderate, very, very moderate. And if the Senate starts taking up what is considered to be leftist policies, whether it be Medicare for all, whether it be a Green New Deal, whether it be packing the Supreme Court. This is all a big hypothetical, of course, that they'll take up any of those things, but it'll be interesting to see how Kelly and Manchin come down. 50-50 doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get 50 votes every time. So it'll be interesting to see how all of that plays out if it comes down to 50-50. While we're still on the Senate, I am not a man who can leave well enough alone. So let's talk about 2022, even before we finish 2020. Midterm elections almost always hurt the party who holds the White House. So that could be good news for the Republicans, as they have 22 seats up for grabs. I mean, the disadvantage of being the party with more seats is you're always going to have more seats that are up for grabs, even in senatorial elections, which are, of course, every 6 years. So look at Pat Toomey in Pennsylvania. He's retiring. That seat is probably going to go blue. Richard Burr in North Carolina is retiring. That seat could probably go blue. If Cal Cunningham wins that Senate seat, even more so, it sets up the Democratic race for Senate in North Carolina in 2022 very nicely. Even if the Republicans are able to hold on to a majority in the 117th Congress this year, they might lose that in 2022 just by virtue of the fact that they have more seats up for grabs. You'll see here, and you're probably checking your screen, I have bolded the people that are going to have very tough races. This is assuming Martha McSally gets in at all, which she probably won't. But you'll notice I've bolded Chuck Schumer just for the sake of conversation. There's almost no doubt in my mind that someone will try to primary Chuck Schumer from the left, whether it be AOC, whether it be someone else on her team. There is no question that the far left would rather see Chuck Schumer out of there and somebody else as the majority or minority leader now, possible majority leader in the Senate. So I think he's going to have a very, very tough re-election battle. You can't you can't be a person who keeps saying we need term limits, we need to get a lot of the older folks out, we need to have a changing of the guard, and not expect that to also be you. So I would expect that there will be some serious challenges to Schumer in 2022, but that is a ways down the road. Let's get through 2020 and survive before we worry about all of that. I'm going to spend, I'm not going to spend a lot of time, frankly, on the House here. I will spend a lot more time on the House during our post-election webinar, which will be literally the day after the election, November 4th. But the numbers I'm running, the forecasters, I believe, the races that I'm looking at, I believe the Democrats will pick up about 11 seats and expand their lead to somewhere in the neighborhood of about 243 to 192. The good news is that the overwhelming majority of our legislative champions, the people that really go to bat for the O&P profession, are in safe seats, with the exception of Jeff Van Drew. Some of you might remember he was elected as a Democrat from New Jersey and then fairly quickly switched his party affiliation to Republican, became a staunch supporter of President Trump. Frankly, that has not worked out terribly well for him in what was already a pretty moderate district. So he is facing some trouble on November 3rd. So we'll see what happens with that. But most of our champions, even guys like Stephen Horsford, who thought he was going to have a much tougher campaign than he is. He won a seat that had been kind of bouncing forth Democratic and Republican. It had been Republican a while. It looked like he would have a pretty tough re-election battle, but he's likely to win that seat now. So pretty smooth sailing for a lot of our champions, which is great. But again, I anticipate that Democrats will probably pick up about 11 seats before the end of the day next Tuesday. I want to emphasize again, if you tell me what the headlines say the day before the election, I'll tell you who wins the election. Yes, there has been a massive, and I mean massive, increase in early voting, especially by Democrats, but the bulk of voters will still be heading to the polls on November 3rd. The presidential race, for all intents and purposes, is too close to call in my mind, and likely will be, even on, as you've been hearing, past election night. Several swing states will start counting their votes before Election Day. Indeed, some have already been counting them. Arizona and North Carolina, of course, two big swing states, are already opening and tallying mail-in ballots. But for Iowa, for example, won't start until the day before Election Day. Michigan and Wisconsin won't even begin opening absentee ballots until the morning of Election Day. And that's millions and millions of votes that needed to be recorded, need to be tallied. That will take time, and that will take more than one day to do it. So be ready on the night of November 3rd, as we're all tuning in to watch the pundits go crazy, that we will not have a decision that day. Certainly not until the wee hours of the next morning. So just be ready for that. I think a lot of the House races and Senate races may be decided by then, but the presidential race, probably not, just because of the influx of mail-in ballots. All that said, I will tell you everything you need to know about what happened the day before on the day after, November 4th. I will have a very, very quickly turned around overview of what all transpired. It will be a very late night for me, but being a policy nerd, election night is always a lot of fun for me. So I'm not sure we'll know, like I said, who the president is, but there will be some high-level trends we can look at. We'll know if there's a blue wave or not, and I can tell you how our champions did. And at that point, I will also tell you, based on how things are looking, what our outlook for the 117th Congress is, things that we're going to pursue, potential new chairs or returning chairs of committees, and how we'll be able to work with them. So I think it'll be very interesting. It is going to be a very, very fascinating week in 6 days. We're going to have a fascinating debate tomorrow night. As you've heard, they're going to be able to, the moderator is going to be able to mute the mics for 2 minutes while the other person speaks. It'll be very interesting to see how that goes. So looking forward to that. And I will end there unless anybody has any questions. Again, I thank everybody for taking some time out of their day to listen to me go crazy about this stuff, which I love doing.
Not seeing any questions, Justin, but I certainly got a lot of information from this, so I'm sure everyone else did as well.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks again, everybody, for tuning in, and we will see you on November 4th. Take care of yourselves.